Thank you, everyone, for taking time to come to this session. I'll be talking about an open technology stack for AI. I have multiple roles at Carnegie Mellon, but the hat I'm wearing today is the executive director of the Open Forum for AI, and I'll be talking a little bit about that as well. So sorry, the window's open. I didn't know what that sound was. I'm going to do something a little bit odd and start with the punchline, the lead, the bottom line, whatever you want to call it. And I'll come back to this at the end. This is a figure from a paper that's linked at the bottom. I'm assuming the slides will be shared with everybody. It's called Toward a Framework for Openness in Foundation Models. In February of 2024 at Columbia University, Columbia and Mozilla, and I believe Omidyar Network funded a workshop, or a convening as they called it, where they developed this framework. And this figure in the paper is one of the outputs. And I will come back to this figure because I think it gives us a blueprint for this open technology stack that I'll be describing to you during this talk. So I mentioned leading the Open Forum for AI. Just very quickly, what is OFAI? It is an academic and nonprofit-led partnership which is aiming to bend the arc toward human-centered AI with openness as a design principle. So my research interests are in digital infrastructure and how openness played a role with that, particularly with the protocols like TCP/IP and HTTP, but also how a balance between a triad, or I've been told I should just say Trinity since I'm here at Trinity, of government, industry, and academia came together to build the internet and the web, and how I believe that balance has shifted when you move from the internet to the web to AI, where the private sector has arguably a more proportionate kind of impact. And I don't say that in a negative way. I'm not trying to criticize the private sector. I'm just simply pointing out that balance has changed, and that OFAI believes it's important to have the academic and nonprofit voice back into that in an equal kind of partnership. So that's an important premise of what we're trying to do through OFAI. The openness in AI framework is at the foundation of the work we're doing through OFAI. I showed you that figure from the paper. It was very much an inspiration around this. A few key points that I want to raise is this is intended to be a technical framework. Now, one point I've looked at in terms of infrastructure development, this is any kind of infrastructure, not just digital, is the importance of the social aspects. So these are socio-technical kinds of problems. And I'll give you one example. Is with infrastructure development, if you move too quickly to trying to come up with a standard, you may choke or stifle the type of creativity and innovation that needs to happen. But if you wait too long, then you may get bifurcation, balkanization, fragmentation, and so on. Right? So, for example, railroad gauge in the United States is a good example. There used to be regional networks. I live in Baltimore. There was the Baltimore and Ohio rail network. There was the Pacific network. There was one in the Midwest and so on. All of them had their own railroad gauges. But at some point, if you wanted to move freight between the East and the West Coast in the United States, everybody agreed, let's have this railroad gauge and a common railroad gauge. And mind you, that was based on some sort of cart that people used back in the day. It's actually not the most efficient railroad gauge that you can use. This was proven by an English engineer who tried to get this alternate gauge to be adopted, but since it had been successful for railroad interoperability, if you want to call it that, it's stuck. But that timing is really critical. So when I say technical framework, I don't just mean technology. I mean the social aspects are critical, right? And that community engagement is critical as well. We want to define openness, and I know this is a topic we could talk about all day if we wanted to. So I'm not up here to tell you I have the definition for openness. I'm just saying that one of the key things we're trying to do through OFAI is build on existing kind of pieces, like the open source AI definition that the Open Source Initiative led a process to come up with. I'm a board member of OSI. But we don't assume that that's complete. There are other dimensions to openness that need to be examined and put into this kind of framework. And that a key aspect is moving from the principles, the benefits, the values we've had from open source software, particularly the 4 freedoms, and I'll come back to that in a second, to open governance. And the lead of our research group has a really good, interesting way of thinking about governance, in which he says people immediately think about regulation and policy. Sure, that is a part of governance. but so are best practices, so are cultural norms, so are ways in which people work together. Governance is a much more comprehensive way of thinking about addressing something rather than specifically thinking about a technology approach or a policy approach or a kind of litigation strategy or so on. And we want to look at the openness in the context of why, who, when, for what purposes. Openness is not the end goal, it's a means to get to certain kinds of goals. So I'll shift a little bit to some of the ecosystem types of questions or observations that I have. And I'm often here in the United States in particular about the AI dominance that the US has, right? And I've often wondered, what does that mean when you say that the US is dominating AI? I think most people think of this kind of diagram where you look at the chatbot traffic and how much OpenAI's ChatGPT is dominating that chatbot traffic, right? A couple of interesting observations is that DeepSeek moved up to number 2 in this diagram sometime late last year, right? And that you see ChatGPT still has a significant kind of lead when you look at chatbots. But even as of early this year, this is changing. So this is a snapshot from January of this year, and you can see that it's called OpenAI here, but ChatGPT's market share is dropping. And that is something that's continuing to happen. And you're starting to see more chatbots even get into this kind of mix. So even if you have that very, I would call it narrow view of AI as chatbots, this landscape is changing fairly quickly and fairly rapidly. And if you do something like go to Hugging Face and look at their leaderboard, so this is basically a snapshot from maybe not yesterday or 2 days ago, 3 days, whenever I put the slides up, of what's trending on Hugging Face. And they have most downloaded, they have most likes. I'd encourage you just to go look at these. I do this every so often, probably more than I should, but just to see how things are trending. And if you look at the names of the models, many of them are Chinese. There's an increasing number of them that are coming from India. And there are very few that come out of the big tech companies in the US. And you might say, well, this isn't really a fair comparison because the big tech companies aren't open. And I would say, that's true. Is that a feature or a bug? If you want to have impact on this community forum, and I kind of think of Hugging Face as like the GitHub for AI. It's not just a platform, it's a community as well, right? It's where people come together to use different types of AI, to build on different types of AI. It's a very different picture. So I don't think you can look at something like this and say there's US dominance when you look at a forum like Hugging Face. This is the most downloads, just to reinforce this. I like this, the not safe for work image detection from Falcon, which is a model from the Gulf. And then this is the most likes. So over time, you can still see that DeepSeek is number 1 in this viewpoint. Now, I'm not the only one that is observing this and that is thinking about the implications of this. This is something called the American Truly Open Models, or ATOM project, which is something that developed last year. And this is a group of people that is basically asserting for US competitiveness, for American AI research, we need to have more open models, right? So that you might think of many other reasons why it's important to do that, but if you have only that lens of the US's competitiveness and its ability to do research in AI, the importance of having open models. And to reinforce this, this is just a screenshot of some of the people who've signed this, right? So you see the CEO of Hugging Face, you see somebody at NVIDIA, you see someone who used to be at OpenAI, the co-founder of PyTorch, right? So there are academics who've signed this as well, right? I've signed it as well, but these are people from the private sector. So these are not, who you might think of as, oh, who would sign something like this? It's big tech companies. It's people from the industry in the US and from other countries. So they're recognizing this, and they're producing these kinds of charts from Hugging Face, by the way, that show, in essence, the curves. So USA was largely because of Llama when it came out as an open weights model, right? But look what's happening over time. You can already see where the inflection is happening in terms of the red, which is the Chinese line. These are some other views. They cleverly say catching the llama, but you can see what's happened over time with these open source types of or open models, however you want to call them. Again, the ones they're showing here are from China and from France. And then the adoption across the region by month. You can see the trends that are happening over the last year and a half in the graph on the right. Just a few more. Some of the community rankings, and then interestingly, the performance, right? So one thing that I heard a lot, even up until last year, is, well, sure, there are these open models, but they don't perform as well. But even that gap is closing, right? And I just saw a reference to a paper from a colleague at Carnegie Mellon. I was too jet lagged last night to read it, so I haven't read it yet, but it is now in one of my browser tabs, and I will look at it. And the abstract, at least, I got through the abstract, claims that this performance gap is closed even more. So once I've read it, maybe I'll update the slides, or maybe I'll point folks to it. So it's not only just adoption on Hugging Face, which you might say, okay, big deal, popularity, what does that mean? It's also performance. This is becoming a much closer race, if you want to think of it that way. So in this context, I do believe, as I mentioned, I am a board member of OSI, so maybe I'm putting that hat on for a second. I am fully aware that there's a lot of controversy around this definition. And I'm not here to debate that. I'm just here to acknowledge that. I'm here to say that I am one of the few people who think, I shouldn't say few people, I'm one of the people on the board who think that the most important thing is the thing on the top right, version 1.0, right? So OSI is committed to coming up with the next version of this definition. But what I will say is I do think this conversation, if I can use that, and I think one of the most useful things about the open source AI definition that OSI sort of led the process, if you will, was that community engagement, right? And again, I don't pretend to think that was perfect, and I'm not saying it included everybody it should have included, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But I do think having a community process was helpful and was important. And I think it was much more important than at the time, and this is shifted, which is also very important. It was arguably Meta who was making the most strong counter case with their open weights model, Llama, right? And I think that it's important to have a community-based definition or set of definitions or norms or best practices rather than any single entity, whether that's a private company, a university, take your pick. The other kinds of interesting trends that have happened since that Columbia convening are really the rise of small models, smaller models with more focused, curated data sets for more specific kinds of use cases. So rather than trying to have this sort of general purpose technology or all-encompassing artificial general intelligence, being much more focused, and then the rise of agents, the use of agentic AI. I attended a workshop in Washington, D.C. last year where there were experts from the agentic AI community. Truth be told, much of it went over my head. But what I was most fascinated by is we spent an entire morning debating the definition of agentic AI and did not come up with one. We came up with several. But fundamentally, as far as I can tell, it's really, is it something that can access data and tools and sort of augment your AI capability beyond a chatbot or beyond a foundational model? So let's just assume that's kind of a working definition for agentic AI. We're starting to see a lot more happen with the use of agents in particular contexts. You will see reports that basically tell you people have used AI and 95% companies have seen no difference and no increase in productivity. And then you will see people saying, I'm using AI and it's transforming my entire workflow. We're able to do things differently and so on and so on. My sense is it's sort of in that place of I signed a contract or an enterprise agreement with a chatbot and I gave it to people and magic didn't happen. Versus we have very specific kinds of data, very specific kinds of use cases, very specific requirements and applications, and we're going to use a much more diverse approach. We're going to use the large models, small models, and the agents and orchestrate them to do certain kinds of things. And then you might see tremendous kinds of gains or productivity. So I think these are really important developments that have happened since that Columbia convening in February of 2024. In terms of where AI has been moving over the last 2 years. It's interesting to me that people keep saying AI moves really quickly, and then other people saying it hasn't changed my life at all, right? But I think if you go a little bit below the surface, what you might do just interacting with ChatGPT, you'll start to see it's a little bit more nuanced than that. And there are still sort of, I don't know, basic kinds of frustrations I have. So I'll just give you an anecdote. I'm having plumbing issues in my home. So I was asking ChatGPT some questions about what does this mean and so on and so on. And I went back to it later, and I don't mean just like a minute later, like quite a bit later. And I'd heard this is an interesting development, that in 2025, according to the US News and World Report rankings, which you may care or you may not, Tsinghua University in China became the #1 engineering school in the world. And I asked ChatGPT that question, and it inexplicably said Tsinghua University has an excellent civil engineering department, which is the field that deals with water systems and so on and so on. I'm like, why the hell are you telling me this? So I literally said, forget the damn toilet, and ran the prompt again. And it said, yes, Tsinghua University was ranked #1 in use. So the memory issues that these things have, I used ChatGPT to track what I was eating because I wanted to increase my protein intake. And I found that I couldn't use it for anything else because it would forget what I ate. It would tell me I ate things I hadn't eaten. It cannot tell you the protein and fat content of Costco pizza. It cannot. I have to repeatedly go in and read it and tell it why. So I stopped doing anything with it on my phone other than just tracking my meals. And after 2 days, it would say, can you tell me what you had for breakfast? And I would say, I already told you what I had for breakfast. Oh, did you have a bagel with turkey, egg, and cheese? No, that was yesterday. Are you sure? I'm sure. I did not have that today. So there are these kinds of issues that continue to plague, if you will, these large foundational models. So this is a slide from my colleague Vince Shaw, who is going to give a demo of a system called DARE in the next session. And if you are inclined, I'd encourage you to go there. And he generated this with his own content, but then used AI to do this. And I'm not going to go into all this into detail, but you could take a look at it. But I think it's a really visually appealing and interesting way of thinking about learning and what these models are really doing. So I had the pleasure of going to a workshop a couple of weeks ago in Geneva at CERN about open science hardware. And one of the presenters, I had heard that from a child learning development expert at Johns Hopkins, you learn more before you're 6 than you do the rest of your life. And I kept thinking about that, thinking, that's either really depressing or really inspiring. And then I heard this person at CERN say, you know, one of the first things you learn is physics. I thought, what are you talking about? Babies don't learn physics. He said, when you learn how to walk, you're learning physics. You're learning about gravity, you're learning about center of mass, you're learning about balance, trial and error, and so on. You don't teach a toddler how to walk by showing them thousands of hours of videos of other toddlers walking, right? So there's a big difference between something that predicts what's coming next versus something that learns, right? And fundamentally, where I think we will start to make more progress is accepting that there is some symbiosis or symbiotic relationship here, and that people remain really good at certain things, and these foundation models and smaller models are good at other things, and you bring them together. I talked about DARE. So this is one of the platforms that's come out of the Open Forum for AI. Largely speaking, it's an LLM gateway. If you have time to go to the session next, I would encourage you to do so. But in essence, we are embracing this idea of the human AI kind of symbiosis, giving people more agency and autonomy. So moving away from here's your chatbot, consume it, and hope for the best, to interact with different forms of AI, different types of agents. Take them off the rails if you want, make them hallucinate, understand, try to understand better when that happens. Slowing people down instead of trying to be more efficient and productive. Learning and research are not linear, productive, efficient purposes. One of the most insightful things I heard from a vice president for research once was, research is supposed to be expensive. It's supposed to be messy. It's supposed to be nonlinear, right? You need to embrace that. Stop trying to pretend it's anything but that. So DARE is a platform that reflects a lot of these kinds of, lessons, if you will. So let me come back to this diagram. As I'd mentioned, this is something that was, formed at this convening and was real inspiration for me in terms of thinking about OFAI. Three main points that I want to make about this diagram, at least for now. The first is they make a very interesting and useful distinction between the artifacts on the left side of that, so the infrastructure, the components, the UI, things like that, and the attributes on the right. And the attributes, they mean things like documentation, licenses, metadata, model cards, you name it, so on. In the 2 years that have passed since this was produced, I think we have more knowledge of the left side of this diagram now, more understanding of the engineering pieces. So whatever we do toward an open technology stack, we can spend more time looking at the engineering pieces. We have more open components. We have more open systems that you can use. You have things like DARE. And I come at this, I'm a systems engineer by training, in terms of demonstrate to me what that means, right? So definitions of openness built around demonstrations of interoperability. One of the questions that comes up a lot, I think particularly in Europe, is this idea of sovereignty. I get it. What I will say is I don't know that we need 50 national AI models. Is that a good future for us to have? Or is it preferable to have agency? Those two words get used interchangeably, but I think they're different. Agency to me is much more about interoperability. It's about that ability for me to pick and choose and swap components and change them over time. As policies change, as technology change, as we learn about safety issues, can I swap them out? I think that's more critical in some sense. The second is that we now have protocols, right? I don't blame these folks 2 years ago for not thinking about things like OpenMind SIFT or MCP from Anthropic or A2A from Google, but we have those protocols now. And I think those protocols are really important pieces of glue, right? That one can think about in the context of this open technology stack. And that we, in my opinion, we want those protocols to be open, right? The value of TCP, IP, and HTTP being open protocols for innovation, for profit, for revenue, for economic activity, for the private sector, not just the other types of things you might imagine, has been absolutely critical. And I think we have an opportunity to do that. So through OFAI, we are calling upon people to join this effort, to design this blueprint for an open technology stack, and to do this in a community way, right? OFAI has some access, if you will, to different parts of the community, but they're certainly more represented here and of course throughout the globe. And in terms of throughout the globe, we are living in interesting times. And I understand saying that as someone living in the United States, it's at least awkward. But this has been true for a long time. If you're not familiar with this, this is, I don't know if I'm saying this right, the UC circle. So if you put a dot in the middle of the Yunnan province in China and draw a circle that's actually not that big, 50% of the world lives inside that circle. That's been true for a long time, right? So when we talk about building global AI, really important to think about something like this. This is a project coming out of Kenya called Amini, up in the top left. This is a group of countries that are coming together to build an AI model. And right now it's being used in over 25 countries. And you can see they're basically saying that the data that's collected, processed, and distributed in the global south is processed using this model. We need to be aware of these kinds of shifts. In essence, the geopolitical centroid of the world is shifting. We can debate in what direction, in what way, at what pace, but it's shifting. And that'll have to be really important as we think about this open technology stack. These are some of the people involved in Amini. And I'm just going to very quickly end by just going through a few slides about the working groups and the people of OFAI because I want to acknowledge them. You can see the different working groups that we have. We have these different university and academic institution partners, these nonprofits organizations representing civil society. We have individual fellows from the private sector and public sector because their perspective is still important. We don't think of them as full-fledged partners. And then these are some of the folks who have funded our work. And with that, I will end, and I hope we have a little time for questions. Thank you. Yeah, I think we have time. Massive amounts of time for questions. 15 minutes. And I should give them the mic, yes? Oh, thank you. That's very kind of you.
For the recording, please speak into the mic.
Thanks talk. I had a question about the small language models that you mentioned. Is there a definition of what a small language model is? And is it small enough that potentially there is an opportunity there for truly open source models where like the training is actually open source, not just the weights?
Yeah. Yeah, I was worried someone would ask me this question. It's a good question. That's why I mentioned the thing about agents. So I don't have a clear definition of a small language model. I'm not sure that there's one that's a consensus published definition. I think fundamentally from what I can gather, it's the idea that you don't have to have infinite data, infinite compute, infinite processing, so on, and build a large foundational model. That small language models can be built on top of those, so to speak. So there's some reasoning, which is an interesting word, reasoning capabilities built into these foundational models, and you can leverage that for more specific kinds of cases. That's my sense of what the smaller language models are about. Yeah, I do think there's, even at the foundation level, we're starting to see some inroads with the open models, right? Certainly with the smaller models, it should be theoretically easier, right? To say, if I pick just the open source AI definition, for example, if I'm training with a much smaller data set, one of the reasons the data provision was described the way it was is I had this conversation with someone at Carnegie Mellon who works on digital twins. And I said, how big are the data sets you're using to train your AI models? He said, they're 2 petabytes apiece. And I said, well, don't send me 2 petabytes, please. I don't want that. But with a smaller model, you can imagine it's much more tractable, right, to be able to share the data and so on. So I think there are opportunities like that to be more open.
When I started programming, I had a 4K computer. And now I have a thing in my pocket. But 2 petabytes doesn't seem like that much if we think about the future.
Sure.
And I'm curious about just the risks of putting a stake in the ground around what open means, such that I can't make sure that the AI system that I'm using is actually open for me.
Right.
So you talk about a new definition or a version 1.1 or 2. Are you going to look at that again?
Yeah. So when you say, am I going to look at that? I have multiple hats on. Here's a couple of things I'd say. First of all, I'm not a lawyer. But I'm surrounded by legal expertise on the board of the OSI. My understanding is that one of the reasons that OSI adopted the approach that they did, and it's very much at the right side of that diagram, the attribute kind of layer, right, is from a legal perspective, if you think about something like the EU AI Act, right, which has a provision in it for open source AI, from a legal perspective, it needs to be more binary than you might need it in other contexts. So for a policymaker in the European Union wants to decide if something's open source AI, they don't want to have a 2-hour conversation with me. They want to be able to look at something and say yes or no, it's open source AI or it's not. So I understand with that motivation and working with the sort of open source developer community that OSI typically has had relationship with, how that definition came to be. I've stated this publicly, I've stated it to the board, is that the evolution of that definition needs to have much more AI engineering input into it, right? So more of that left side of the diagram. To your point, I don't think making a definition with fixed kind of parameters today makes sense. This kind of number of parameters, this number of data, whatever, because that will change, right? What used to be a large model 2 years ago is not very large anymore. So I don't think you can, my opinion is I don't think we want to make those definitions based on fixed estimates for those types of characteristics. But again, to my point, it's more about the performance. It's more about the demonstrability of something being interoperable or something being open, rather than this is the threshold at which something becomes important. I don't know if that answers the question, but that's the best I've got for now. Yeah, no, it's a good question. It's a good conversation to have. Yeah.
Can you say your name and where you're from?
Sure. Jen Choudhury, University of Cambridge. In the earlier session, we were talking about mitigating risks that can arise from open source software like ghost guns, and also its use in sensitive contexts like cochlear implants. But within the open source AI realm, there are a couple of different ways of approaching the topic of human rights-based responsible AI. One is potentially drawing on, say, what we have learned and past interventions, but also approaching it from the existing regulatory framework, like the EU AI Act. In the approach of Open Forum for AI, are you focusing on specific case studies? Are you looking at it more from this is the regulation we have to respond to that, or is it more drawn from a wider base?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'd like to believe that one of the benefits that OFAI brings is we have this multidimensional perspective on how to address something like evaluation, safety, risk. I'm not trying to criticize in any way people who go deep in particular ways, but I think it is a complex enough problem that it requires this multidimensional approach. I mean, I maybe somewhat silly say that why don't we use multidimensional approaches to something that is fundamentally multidimensional like AI? I think that the biggest issue / challenge that I worry about in this context is remediation. And let me try to explain what I mean about that. So if I'm told that a plane has certain failure modes with certain probabilities of those failure modes, then most engineering teams can say, okay, we can address that, right? We can deal with it. And some of them may be out of your control. Lightning strikes a plane, that's not the plane design fault, and so on. So we have within OFAI the AIMSEC team at Carnegie Mellon, which has been funded by the US NIST, National Institutes of Safety and Standards and Technology, to come up with an evaluation framework. And a lot of discussion around model cards, data cards, and so on. My question at the end of all that is, what are you going to give the engineering team that can help them remediate that issue, right? So you've identified this is a safety issue, or this is a risk, or so on. These things are still very statistical. They're very opaque. It's very hard to know why they're making the predictions they make. What will you do with that information, right? How will you remediate it? To me, if it's, again, like I said, openness is not an end. I don't know if Josh said this earlier today, openness is a means, not an end. I also don't think evaluation is the end. It's a means, right, toward making these things more safe. So I think unless we can find a way to connect that evaluation and the remediation, I'm not sure any particular approach is going to be more promising than the other. Again, I'm not sure that's a good answer to your question, but that's where I am now. I will also point out, I met someone from Hugging Face recently who said that about 1/3 of the models on Hugging Face have their model cards filled out, but he said that those models generate 85% of their traffic. So there's another nice plug for being open about what you're doing.
Hi, Bill Brennan, Johns Hopkins. You talked early in your conversation about the transition from open source to open governance and how Open Forum for AI is trying to make that move. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about what you see as the endpoint for that and Open Forum for AI's role in both the transition, but as well as that endpoint.
Yeah. So I think there are some cases already where we have open source projects that because they don't have open governance, it's caused issues. How do we avoid that with AI? Noting we don't have a consensus definition for open source AI. But assuming we did, how do we make sure that the governance itself is open so that you don't do open washing and you don't have sort of the structural effects that we've had with that misalignment, if you will? Again, I'm not saying these are perfect organizations. A fan of the IETF and the W3C, right? I view those as successes in terms of open governance for the internet and the web. So it wasn't enough. It was certainly necessary, but it wasn't sufficient to build the protocol, to make the protocol open. You need to have a group that can keep working on this and iterating and developing it. There's this great book called Where Wizards Stay Up Late. I don't know if you're familiar with it, the creators of the internet story. They deliberately left out security. They did it on purpose, right? Because they knew it would cause all sorts of challenges they didn't want to deal with. But clearly, we needed to deal with security at some point. So that's a good example, something that gets addressed by this open governance process and organizations. I'm not saying OFAI needs to be that organization, but maybe it can help foster what that organization looks like, and maybe it can help contribute to what that kind of open governance looks like.
Any more questions? Saeed, Richard Littauer, curious. You mentioned sovereignty and how it would be better not to have every single country have their own models, but be able to pick and choose. There's two definitions of sovereignty. One of them is you're building a castle around which no one else can enter. And the other one is that you can basically stand alone if needed, but you don't have to.
Right.
Have you seen any signs that movements like the Open Forum for AI are helping to disambiguate the two and make that trickle down to policymakers?
Good question. Short answer, no, I have not, but I think it's a really important point. To that second version that you described, one of the other questions I have, concerns I have about the idea of sovereignty leading to national AI models, let me put it that way, is many nations won't be able to do that, right? They just don't have the resources, and quite frankly, shouldn't chase the resources to do that. So that may argue for leaning into that second definition, that you can stand alone if you want. The Amini project may be a good example of that. But OFAI hasn't done anything in that area, but I think it would be a very useful one to explore.
Thank you. That opened up some more questions.
Oh, okay.
It's more a comment than a question. I think living in a multi-linguistic area, the European Union, these are large language models. You know, one of the major issues of the national ones is not necessarily we want our own LLM.
Sure.
It's we want
Absolutely.
our LLM that understands our language and our cultural background.
Absolutely.
So we speak with people from Estonia, Latvia. They have minority languages,
Yes.
not sufficient quantitative text to have these petabytes for training, but they still want to have that. I wouldn't say called bias, because I like what you call it, something imbalance in the slide. And I think that is important actually for recognition within the EU and probably around the world. Not you know, not everybody speaks English and comes from an Anglo-white background, as we can see here.
Point.
So I think it's very important.
Thank you.
Daniel Schoen, St. Louis University. I'm wondering, you mentioned the social dimensions. It's very easy to lean in on the technical aspects, and the social dimensions often fall back to sort of culture and sort of people like us care about things like this. This is what's meaningful to me as an engineer. And by culture, I don't mean necessarily ethnic culture. I mean sort of, you know, identity culture, role-based culture. Policymakers care about things like this. Engineers care about things like this. And people get into open source for various cultural reasons that often are at cross purposes at various points. And I'm curious if you guys in OFAI have started thinking about sort of the first principles that motivate the cultural dimensions of people's motivations and rationale in terms of being able to at least understand and map how people are thinking about these things and why they might have a certain, you know, propelling argument for this or that approach to a given set of problems.
Yeah. So again, short answer is no. We haven't looked at that yet. I just, you know, it's important for me to say that. But probably a more interesting response is, and this may seem a little bit somewhat out of alignment, but again, one of the, I think, benefits of what we try to do through that community process for the open source AI definition is adhere to those 4 freedoms, right, of open source software. I can use, study, modify, and share it. I think those are part of the culture that you're describing, or part of the freedoms or principles of that culture. To the extent we can bring that to open source AI, whatever that means, in my opinion, is really important, right? So the reasons that people felt like they wanted to contribute to that ethos of being able to use, study, share, modify, I think would make perfect sense in the world of AI. It's not as seamless as I just described it. AI is much more complex than software. It has more interaction effects and all that wonderful stuff. But I agree with you that trying to hang on to that cultural, that's what I mean about it's more than just a definition or whatever. It's a set of norms. It's a sort of set of expectations, maybe, of how you have to. Sorry, I'm still somewhat jet lagged. Yesterday we had a conversation. I don't remember who it was with, around this idea of people contributing, and is there a shift in mindset? I'm going to sound like the old man, get off my lawn right now, right? Is there a shift in the mindset with younger people that it's much more transactional? It's much more, what do I get out of this? I'm not an expert in whether that's true or not, but I think it would be a shame if we lose the mindset of I'm contributing to this and there's no expectation on my part. I'm getting something back. I'm just doing it because it's the right thing to do. So I'd like to believe we can maintain that. And if OFAI can help do that, then more power to it.